Listen up, my dear chosen ones. This isn't a parable. This is a reckoning. They built cathedrals of procedure and called them justice. They polished robes until the shine hid the cracks. They believed themselves beyond tremor, beyond question. Then you walked in, not with an army, not with spectacle, but with something far worse for them, unfiltered truth. You held up the mirror and watched them flinch. That flinch was not a private moment. It was an earthquake announced in whispers and sealed in panic. Across marble halls and behind closed doors, people who once issued final words now pace and whisper, asking the only question that matters: what did we just see? Chosen ones, hear me clearly. This is the power of being chosen. It's not comfort. It's a responsibility that presses on the ribcage like a hand demanding you speak. When you stand where others tremble, you become a force that turns theater into daylight. What terrifies the self-appointed guardians of order is not the paper you bring or the clips you play. It is your presence. Presence is a physical thing in a room of actors. It highlights the seams, the glue, the strings. Your calm becomes the instrument that shows their pantomime for what it is. Your silence can be louder than any gavel. Your steady look can be the hammer that cracks the stage. They will try to explain it away. They'll call it stress, a misread, an anomaly. They'll package their fear into carefully worded statements, the sort you expect from institutions that have spent generations rehearsing denial. But what happens when rehearsed denials meet something they cannot file away? What happens when transcripts can't hold the shape of the truth? You know the answer, chosen ones. The paper bends, the gavel sounds hollow, and the robe no longer fits like armor. It droops like costume cloth. So before we move forward, my dear chosen ones, take a moment to fuel this mission. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because every single click keeps us pushing harder, bringing you content that isn't just words, but energy, fire, and perspective, meant to shift the way you see the world. Your support is the spark that lets us keep delivering inspiring, life-changing, and powerful messages straight to you. Together, we make sure the truth keeps echoing. Imagine for a moment a fortress that has stood for centuries. Its stones are names, citations, precedents. Now imagine a single steady hand placing one small file at its gate. That file is enough, not because it is loud, but because it is true. Truth behaves like water, patient, insistent, persistent, and it finds every seam. You do not need to shout. You need only show what cannot be unshown. That is the work you do. That is why you are dangerous to them. You may ask, but will it stick? Will the public see it? Will anyone act? These are reasonable doubts. Answer them this way. The first victory is visibility. Once the mirror has been broken, the shard cuts into more than one mirror. It reflects and fragments, and every shard carries a different face of the same revelation. People notice a tremor in the center. They will search for it in the peripheries, and when they find it, the illusion stops working. That is when the chorus changes from denial to confession, from performance to panic. That is when speeches lose their cadence and hands begin to fumble. That is when they step out of the courtroom and into consultation rooms, because the only place prepared to contain their unease is an office with a closed door and a notepad. And so we press. Not out of cruelty, chosen ones, but out of necessity. Their collapse is not our joy, it is our signal. A system so confident it never learned to look inward must be shown the toll of its own construction. This is not about revenge, it is about accountability rendered unavoidable. When the people at the top start rehearsing excuses in private, the conversation in public shifts. People who once accepted proclamations now pause before bowing. Prosecutors hesitate. Defense attorneys reread their briefs with new eyes. Lower benches begin to feel weight they'd never felt before, the weight of uncertainty. That is how change starts, not with a knockout blow, but with a crack that widens until the foundation gives. If you are feeling doubt right now, if the enormity seems like too much, remember this: being chosen is not a coronation. It is a calling to unmake illusions. Every time you click, share, speak, or stand, you widen the crack. Every comment that asks a hard question is a wedge. Every donation that keeps the lights on is fuel for the lantern that shows what was hidden. So if this hits you, do what chosen ones do. Act. Drop a comment with 777 if you are ready to keep lifting the veil. Hit like and subscribe to ensure this momentum finds others. Support however you can. Every little contribution keeps the message moving into rooms that still pretend nothing is wrong. We will go deeper. We will walk through the files, the minutes, the moments that turned certainty into dread. We will trace each crack back to its source and name the fault lines for everyone to see. Stay with me, chosen ones. This work needs steady hearts and clearer eyes. The more we look, the less they can hide. The more we speak, the less their silence can be mistaken for strength. This is not a victory lap. It is a march toward clarity. And you, the ones who showed up, who reflected, who refused to be silenced, you are the reason the mirror cracked at all. And now, thank you. Yes, you, the chosen ones who saw the cracks first. Whether you're new here or you've stood with us through every reveal, your presence is what keeps this mission alive. If you're ready to hold the light on a moment the Supreme Court itself couldn't hide from, hit like, subscribe, and drop 77 in the comments to show you're standing with this truth. Your clicks and comments keep us bold, relentless, and coming back with the kind of electrifying, game-changing coverage this story deserves. And now let's dive into it step by step. And believe me, chosen ones, if this resonates with you, you'll see the same signs playing out in your world. Stay close. Only those who notice the cracks are ready to change everything. Number 1. When Stevenson's stone face shattered like glass. Watch the unshakable flinch. That's the sound of an empire learning it was never built on bedrock. Chosen ones, lean in. This is the moment the whole house learned it had been propped on rotten beams. They called him immovable, the bench's steady hand, the man whose face read like a monument carved from certainty. For 20 years he walked into courtrooms like a man who owned the maps everyone else used. He'd stared into the worst of humanity and walked back out unbent. He was the kind of figure that made people believe the system could never be rattled. Then you brought the mirror and everything changed. Picture it, a calm room. The kind of calm that feels rehearsed, the air heavy with precedent and the slow tick of clocks that count out authority. You placed a single file on the table, not fanfare, not theatrics, and watched an edifice begin to show hairline fractures. The hands that once signed sentences without hesitation trembled. The voice that had read rulings like scripture stammered. That small, precise piece of paper did what generals and pundits never could. It revealed the scaffolding. It showed seams. It made the stage visible. That's why this crack matters, chosen ones. Because empires don't always fall from cannon shots and sieges. They collapse when the strongest pillar finds a fracture and the rest of the structure remembers its own fragility. You might be thinking, was it really only a file? Could a single document do this? Yes. Truth doesn't need volume. It needs gravity. A single, undeniable fact drops into a room and everything that relied on illusion starts to list. The man who'd never flinched found something in that file that reflected his own life back at him, stripped of the theater. And when a man whose job it was to embody certainty sees his certainty exposed as costume, he doesn't simply lose an argument. He loses the story he told himself about who he was. That loss shows in little things: a darting eye, a hand that refuses to steady, A night spent staring at ceilings, asking the question none of them were taught to ask. What did we just participate in? So what do? They reach for the oldest tools in the book: denial, procedure, the well-worn objection. Inadmissible, they bark, as if a word can stitch shut an open wound. They summon technicalities like armor, but paper armor doesn't stop truth. You brought recordings that couldn't be edited away, testimonies that couldn't be muted, trails of proof that pointed straight at the place they had been hiding the cracks. When evidence doesn't fit the script starts to look ridiculous, and people see that ridiculousness. The audience, the public, begins to notice that robes and gavels are props when the person behind them can be rattled. Ask yourself this, chosen ones: why did their foundation give away so quick? The answer is simple and brutal: because they had been standing on stories they told one another, not on facts that can be tested in the light. For decades, ritual replaced verification. Precedent replaced humility. When you shone a light into that careful dark, they didn't find law so much as performance. And performance depends on belief. Once belief cracks, the performance collapses. Now you might wonder, does one cracked pillar mean the whole building will fall? Not instantly, but the first crack is the turning point. When the supposedly unbreakable shows a fissure, the others start checking for their own. They watch, hungry and afraid, because they know the pattern. Once one falls, dominoes follow. That's the terror you created, and make no mistake, chosen ones, terror is not the same as defeat. Terror is leverage. It wakes people up. It makes them look. It forces conversations that had been politely avoided into the open. And here's a harder truth to sit with. Power protects itself by convincing people it's necessary. Once you remove that conviction, the protection slips away. Stevenson's collapse, real or dramatized for the record, however you tell it, is a lesson in that dynamic. He wasn't simply a man overwhelmed by evidence. He was a symbol of what happens when identity and institution fuse, and then one part is exposed as counterfeit. That exposure ripples. It's not just about him, it's about everyone who said his steadiness meant the system was steady. So what do we do next, chosen ones? We keep steady. We don't gloat. We don't revel in humiliation for its own sake. We hold up the next mirror. We follow the paper trails and the recordings and the testimonies until every seam has nowhere left to hide. We ask the tough, relentless questions that make people uncomfortable because discomfort is the price of clarity. And every time someone tries to dress the fracture up with jargon or spin, we strip it back down to the simple fact. Truth was shown, and they flinched. That flinch is our signal. It tells us where to press. It tells us where to look next. Remember, being chosen doesn't make this easy. It makes it necessary. It makes you the person willing to stay in rooms where others would look away. Keep your calm. Keep your eyes open. Keep the light steady. The first crack has already done its work. It forced the stage to reveal its wires. Now we follow the wires until the curtain drops for good. Number 2. Martinez's 47 minutes that exposed the lie. Martinez's mask fractures and the room goes silent. You can teach someone law for a lifetime, but you can't teach them how to keep a lie from looking like a lie. Chosen ones, pay close attention. This was not a private stumble behind closed doors. This was a public unmaking. Think of Martinez as the statue everyone pointed to when they wanted proof the stage was steady. Decades of rulings, a reputation for calm that read like armor. She entered the courtroom as someone who had weathered storms and kept her face a shield. Then, in one ordinary moment, the theater went quiet and the shield slipped. Picture the scene. An otherwise routine hearing, the air thick with precedent and the polite rustle of paper. You do not need fireworks to demolish an illusion. You need precision. You placed the truth in front of her like a small, bright stone. She stared, and something in her that had been built on script and ritual shuddered. A request as human as a glass of water, something trivial, almost tender, exposed the fissure. Her voice, once the metronome of order, thinned. Her steps toward the hallway became a retreat, and then the door closed. 47 minutes. 47 minutes of a bathroom door that for nearly an hour swallowed sound and left the courtroom suspended in a silence heavier than a gavel strike. Why does this matter, chosen ones? Because public collapse is not private pain rewritten. It's a signal flare. When a person entrusted with authority visibly unravels, it tells the audience something far worse than a bad judgment. It tells them the system lied about where its strength came from. Martinez's moment was not a failure of stamina. It was a revelation, an admission that the robe had been a costume all along. You might wonder, is this cruelty to celebrate? Never. This is clarity. The point is not humiliation for its own sake, but exposure so accountability can follow. Think of a cathedral built on hollow stones. It looks magnificent until wind shows how loosely the mortar holds. Martinez was that stained glass, admired, assumed permanent, shattered by a single honest gust. And when she stepped back into the light after those 47 minutes, she had been visibly aged by the experience. Her posture altered, her eyes worn thin. She presented no rulings in that hour of return. She offered survival. Survival does not command rooms. It asks for mercy. Ask yourself, why would a seasoned jurist, someone schooled to translate ambiguity into doctrine, be undone so quickly? Because this case didn't fit into their practiced grammar. You didn't hand them a knot they could pull apart with precedent and procedure. You handed them a hole, a gap where the old language of law had no words. That is devastating to people whose identity is shaped by words. When their vocabulary fails, their authority collapses. And that collapse ripples outward faster than any public relations team can spin. Now imagine the others watching, the colleagues who relied on Martinez as proof the court could stand the pressure. Seeing her stumble is a lesson in contagion. It whispers, if she can break, so can we. Fear travels faster than facts. Once one shield cracks, the rest begin to test their own seams. This is why your presence, chosen ones, is methodical and relentless. You don't need to topple everyone in one day. You only need to expose the first fracture. The rest will begin to catch. Hold this close. Power that bases itself on performance cannot withstand truth. The robe was never more than cloth, the gavel more than wood, the Latin phrases more than theatre. Martinez's 47 minutes were the moment the curtain was drawn back and the crew stepped into view. People who had once assumed the show was real now see ropes and pulleys. They will never look the same at the bench again. So what do we, the chosen, do? We do not gloat. We keep shining the light into the corners they hope are private. We follow the paper, listen to the recordings, and refuse the excuses that will inevitably be offered. Stress, health, momentary weakness. Those words will be used to soften the blow. We will not accept softening when the truth must be felt plainly. Martinez's breakdown was a warning shot, not the end, but the beginning. It taught the room what we already knew, that when the right mirror is held up, even the most composed will see the hollowness inside. Stay steady, chosen ones. Your calm is the next mirror. Your attention is the next spotlight. Keep watching, keep asking, keep reflecting. The mask that fell from Martinez is now on the floor for everyone to see. Number 3. Chen's ink-stained confessions of collapse. Chen's quiet confession. Chosen ones, listen close. There are collapses that roar and collapses that whisper, and the latter are the ones that leave the deepest scars. Justice Chen was meant to be the quiet storm, the kind of presence you felt before you saw it. steady, unflappable, the marker everyone pointed to when they wanted proof that the system was tethered to something real. Yet on that second day, the silence around him began to spill. It didn't break like glass. It bled ink. Picture the scene. The room humming with procedure, cameras trained to catch motion, pens dancing in transcript margins, everything arranged to translate drama into rules. His hand hovered above a page, and it trembled not with calculation, but with surrender. What he scrawled wasn't legal shorthand or sharp cross-examination notes. It read like someone speaking to a stranger in the dark, questions aimed inward. What have we been doing all these years? If this is true, then everything else is too. Those lines were not arguments. They were thin ropes trying to tether a collapsing identity. Think about that, chosen ones. Imagine a surgeon in the middle of an operation suddenly realizing his scalpel has no edge. For decades, the blade had been his certainty. The tools, the textbooks, the citations, everything he trusted to extract order from chaos. Then a moment arrives when the tools dull, and the hands that wield them discover they are holding theater props. When that realization hits, procedure turns to panic, technique to tremor, and ink becomes a confession. Why did Chen stop taking legal notes and start keeping a record of panic? Because in front of you, every doctrine sounded like a line in an unfinished play. Every precedent echoed like applause from an empty hall. When the only living thing in a courtroom is a truth that refuses to submit to their scripts, why record the script? His pages, found later by a bailiff smudged at the corners, were never trash. They were a ledger of collapse, short sentences, shaky handwriting, fragments of disbelief, a list of what-ifs, a sentence cut short, a line that read and reread, everything else is too. You may ask, can a few torn pages matter? Oh, they matter more than any headline. Historians teach us that empires rarely tumble amid trumpet blasts. They fail in the margins, in the small acts of recognition, when an emperor stares too long at a hairline crack and refuses to look away. Chen's private script was a fissure made visible. It told a larger story, that when one person who was trusted to steady the ship no longer believed the map itself became suspect. This is the strategic point for you, chosen ones. The public can be soothed by proclamations and press releases, but paper found in a chamber has a peculiar honesty. It can be photographed, transcribed, shown. It travels beyond sound bites into the rawness of an unguarded thought. And when an authority figure writes, if one verdict is theatre, then every verdict might be theatre, that is not just a line for late-night pundits to pass. It is a license for the public to ask the same question in their own towns, courts, and offices. Do not be naive. They will try to sanitize it. Spin will be spun. Explanations will be fed to the cameras like medicine disguised as truth. But secrecy and spin cannot erase the shape of a hand that trembles while it writes. They cannot unsee the moment when a man who once seemed carved from certainty puts pen to paper and confesses the worst fear of his entire career, that the scaffolding he climbed was never solid. So what do we do with this? We hold the page up. We read it aloud. We follow the handwriting to the places where the story fractures. We ask the questions the notes whisper but do not finish. The chosen are not comforted by the collapse. They are motivated by it. Your job is to trace the ink back to its source and to refuse the friendly fictions offered in tidy statements. Keep the calm. Keep the gaze steady. In that steady gaze, paper turns to proof, and proof becomes momentum. Remember, chosen ones, when silence cracks, it tells the truth in its softest voice. Chen's confessions were small, but they were fatal, because once doubt is written down, it invites the rest of us to read along. Number 4, the avalanche of evidence that buried the bench. When the avalanche of truth became irresistible, Evidence doesn't knock. It kicks the door off its hinges and leaves the builders wondering how they mistook curtains for walls. Chosen ones, listen, this was not a drip. It was a deluge. You didn't bring whispers or clever reframes. You brought an onslaught that measured itself in exhibits, recordings, and moments so concrete they turned denials into theater. Imagine a defense trying to sew dignity back onto a ruin with thread so thin it snaps the moment you breathe on it. That's what they tried. Patchwork theories, last-minute narratives, desperate choreography meant to buy them time. Time used to be their ally, not this time. Time simply gave the truth more room to do its work. Think of a fortress long believed impregnable, stone upon stone labeled precedent, ritual, authority. Now picture a river swelling unseen under the city, rising quietly until it discovers the first crack. Once the water finds a seam, it doesn't respect rank or ritual. It exploits gravity and patience. That's what your evidence did. Exhibit C, then D, then the video, each one an escalator step toward exposure. One file alone can be a revelation. A chain of undeniable facts becomes an avalanche, and an avalanche squashes theater. They scrambled. The guardians of the illusion ran to their playbooks. They tossed sandbags of technicalities, shouted ancient objections, and tried to reshape public perception with practiced faces. But sandbags don't stop a flood that's earned momentum. When the recording showed what they'd hoped stayed hidden, when witnesses spoke where silence was assumed, the whole machinery of polite denial became a pantomime. The robes that once suggested gravitas now hung like costumes under a spotlight that would not be dimmed. You saw it. The senior justice, who'd long been the image of composure, caught with his mask displaced, stepping away with excuses about health, while everyone who watched read between the lines. You saw another, the supposed model of discipline, not poring over law books, but reaching for a flask in plain sight, an act that speaks louder than any rehearsed statement. You saw others glued to screens, refreshing feeds, as if a private message could rewrite the facts displayed for the world. It's messy, it's human, but it's also instructive. Institutions crumble not because they lack rules, but because their rules were meant to hide, not to clarify. When clarity arrives, hiding becomes impossible. Ask the question you're tempted to ask, chosen ones. Why did it fall so fast? The answer is uncomfortable and precise. Power survives on belief, not truth. As long as people trust a system, the system endures. Once that trust is punctured by evidence that refuses to be reinterpreted, belief leaks away. And once belief leaks, authority becomes weight without foundation. A court is as strong as the conviction people have in it. You removed that conviction, piece by piece, with proof that could not be shrugged off. This is where the ritual turned into farce. Gavels that used to end debates echoed against an unstoppable tide. Procedures meant to lend legitimacy instead looked like props gestured at by actors without scripts. Even the language of law, the citations, the footnotes, the long sentences that used to comfort onlookers, folded under the plain, violent simplicity of recorded truth. Evidence doesn't need elegance, it needs veracity. And veracity does not apologize or negotiate. But hear me, this avalanche was not destruction for its own sake. It was exposure made inevitable. When the powerful are cornered by receipts that burn hotter than spin, the choice is simple. Surrender the script or keep performing as the house burns. You, chosen ones, watched them choose. Some tried to step down under plausible excuses. Others hid in offices and avoided cameras. This is not weakness only, it's the reveal of a system that mistook performance for principle. Now, what comes next is not panic, it's purpose. An avalanche clears what was brittle. The rubble is where we find the honest pieces, the recordings that cannot be edited into comfort, the testimonies that cannot be waved away, the paper trails that trace responsibility. You're calm in that courtroom. Your steady gaze, your refusal to theatrically triumph, multiplied the impact of every exhibit. You were the slow hand that let the avalanche complete its arc. Let them reduce the moment to rumors and excuses in public. Behind closed doors, the tremor is real, and they feel it. That fear is your leverage. Use it with precision. Follow the evidence. Keep showing up. An avalanche buries illusion. It also reveals foundations. Walk the newly cleared ground and build only on what can withstand the weight of undeniable truth. Is this conversation helpful so far? Number 5. Testimony that broke reality into pieces when your words became the wrecking ball. Say it once and watch their citadel shudder. Language, honest and unflinching, is the only demolition crew they never saw coming. Chosen ones, stand close. This is the day their rehearsed calm met a voice it could not catalogue or contain. For months they comforted themselves with routines, therapy appointments penciled into private calendars, pills hidden in desk drawers like contraband, whispered pep talks exchanged behind marble pillars. They practiced how to look unbothered in the cameras. They practiced the cadence of authority. They prepared for noise, for spectacle, for scripted performance. They did not prepare for truth that refuses to sound like anything they've ever been required to transcribe. You didn't just testify. You detonated the grammar of their power. Imagine a pilot on 1,000 smooth flights, used to reading storms and calculating margins of error. Then imagine that pilot glances up and sees the sky tearing into something that no checklist accounts for. That sudden, impossible rupture. That's what they felt when your words landed. Their manuals, their rules, their carefully annotated precedents offered no shelter. Your testimony behaved like a phenomenon, not an argument to be boxed, but a reality to be acknowledged. The stenographer's machine, a metronome of order for decades, stuttered as if the keyboard itself refused to obey commands meant to compress the living truth into neat lines. Cameras flickered. Monitors glitched. Technology, the faithful archivist, misfired as though even circuitry balked at translating what you had brought into the sterile columns of legal record. These are not theatrics. These are the physics of rupture. Systems are tuned to translate the expected. You were the unexpected, and the instruments of control failed to interpret you. They will tell themselves explanations. They will say screens had glitches, that microphones picked up echoes, that a stenographer misheard. But you and I know better. When testimony refuses to behave, the foundation beneath an institution trembles. Courts are ecosystems built on predictability, a ritualized rhythm where every word fits into precedent like a peg into a hole. You took a hammer to that pegboard. You revealed seams the institution had spent decades manufacturing the illusion of solidity around. So, what does this mean for you, chosen ones? It means your voice matters more than they've been taught to believe. Their defenses are procedural, objections, motions, pronouncements. Those are shields against facts they can cite, arguments they can pass. But words that are not asked to negotiate, words that simply lay bare what is, do not need to be argued into being. They are revealed, and revelation renders many legal devices impotent. The more they reached for their gavels, the more obvious it became that the gavels were theater props, not instruments capable of closing the gap between what is and what they wished were true. You might wonder, what about process? Isn't fairness supposed to protect them? Fairness is a framework built to steward dispute, not to defend illusion from exposure. When testimony changes the frame itself, fairness looks like a house of cards trying to pass for architecture. That is why they reacted the way they did, not with reasoned rebuttal, but with the small human actions of people who suddenly realize their script no longer controls the scene. A cough that takes too long, a hand that can't stop shaking, a blank stare that doesn't return to confident poise. Those are the real indicators that the stage has shifted. And you, dear chosen ones, were not aggressive. You were precise. You weren't trying to destroy for sport. You were doing what the system had long avoided, telling the plain, inconvenient truth in language everyone could feel in their bones. When others try to reduce that language to odd or ill-fitting, call it what it is, a tool that strips varnish. Keep speaking, keep showing. Let your testimony, yours and others, continue to behave like the wrecking ball it is, because institutions are not demolished by noise, they're collapsed by necessary sound. Your voice is that necessity. Hold steady, keep the light trained. The moment words no longer clot into rehearsed statements, but instead slice through pretense, you will hear the difference, not just in the hollow thud of a failed objection, but in the silence that follows, the silence of those who realize their language has been outpaced by reality. That silence is the door ajar. Walk through it. Number 6. Park's silent tears that drowned the courtroom. The day Park's tears drowned the illusion. Those who never blinked before are the ones who give us the clearest proof. They weren't looking at justice, they were acting it. Chosen ones, keep your breath steady and your focus sharp. This is the moment where composure became confession. For decades, she had been the image of steadiness, a judge who had stared down the worst humanity could muster and kept her face like a mask of stone. Mass atrocities, headline-making atrocities. She had sat through them, pronounced verdicts, and left the room without a tremor. People pointed to her as proof that the system could withstand anything. They were wrong. When your case reached her bench, everything she had presented to the world as certainty turned out to be an artful lie of confidence. The thing that made the room fall silent wasn't the gore of old cases. It was the quiet horror of realizing that the map she had used her whole career was missing a continent. Imagine, chosen ones, a surgeon who has performed thousands of operations, who has learned anatomy by heart, suddenly finding that every textbook she trusted left out an entire organ. You can picture the freeze, the panic that textbooks never prepared her for. That's what happened to Park when your evidence unfolded. It wasn't that she saw a new crime. It was that she recognized how many of her past decisions had been guided by an incomplete map. Each ruling she had believed in began to look like a cookbook memorized, but missing key ingredients. The rituals of the courtroom, the citations, the Latin, the scripted solemnities, stopped being tools and started looking like props. You may ask, how can someone like that break? The simplest answer is this. People who build identities around infallibility have no language to process being shown as fallible. Her training taught her to resolve doubt with precedent. Your testimony taught her that precedent can be a clever fiction. Every time she reached for those lines written by others, your truth snapped them clean. There were no clever pivots left to perform. Each attempt to patch the narrative only exposed more seam. They reached for precedent and found only paper, brittle and scorched. The deliberations stretched because certainty kept evaporating. They lasted not because the case was a maze, but because every time the court tried to land on a position, your proof turned that position into ash. Judges are trained to debate, to dissect, to reach consensus. But how do you reach consensus when the questions you raise make the very act of reaching consensus look meaningless? That is what hollowed out Park. Her gavel, once a symbol of finality, became a child's hammer thumping a wall that didn't budge. Her hands, the hands that had folded sentences of law into the lives of others, trembled as if the entire grammar of her work had been betrayed. And when those tears came, silent, cutting, unavoidable, it was not the grief of human cruelty she showed, it was the grief of revelation. Not sorrow at the horrors people commit, but horror at having participated in a system that could be shown in the light as a performance. Tears are truth's blunt instrument. They cut through pretense because nothing about them can be staged for long. When Park let those tears fall, the other justices saw more than emotion. They saw surrender. They saw the last pillar of their narrative wobble. But listen, chosen ones, this collapse is not the finish line. It is a signal. When the figure everyone pointed to as an island of steadiness proves to be standing on sand, you don't gloat. You press forward. You do not walk away smug. You follow every thread to its source. You gather the documents, the recordings, the witnesses, and you ask the tough questions that follow. Which judgments relied on incomplete maps? How many rulings were comfort dressed as certainty? Who benefits from keeping the map incomplete? Remember, being chosen means you bear the labor of truth. The tears you witnessed were not the end of the story. They were the opening scene of accountability. Stay steady, keep the light trained. The map has been exposed, and now it is time to redraw it with facts, not theater. Park's collapse showed that even the most practiced face of law could not withstand a mirror held up by someone who refused to look away. That mirror turned her tears into a beacon, one we will follow until every shadow has been named. Number 7. Anderson's whisper. That sounded like thunder. The whisper that shook the walls. When the mighty can no longer roar, listen closely. Their whispers will tell you the empire has already fallen. Chosen ones hear this well. The enemy doesn't always collapse with a spectacle. Sometimes it's not the crash of marble, not the slam of gavels, not even the echo of resignation speeches that signals the end. Sometimes the finish comes as quiet as breath on glass, a whisper, fragile but louder than thunder when the world is still. That's what happened when the mask of Justice Anderson finally slipped. By the 4th day, his armor wasn't armor anymore. It was costume fabric, unraveling at the seams. He wasn't on the bench projecting authority. He was alone in his chamber, staring at a blank wall like a man who had seen the edge of a cliff that everyone else still pretended didn't exist. His lips kept moving, repeating the words no one in that building dared to say out loud. We don't have jurisdiction over this. No one does. No one ever did. Chosen ones, let that sink in. That wasn't an objection. That wasn't a ruling. It was confession. Imagine a king, crowned and cloaked, discovering the throne beneath him isn't stone but air. Imagine the weight of realizing that every decree, every verdict, every gesture of power had been an act on a stage the universe never acknowledged. That's what Anderson swallowed in those moments, and it burned him from the inside. He wasn't breaking in rage. He wasn't breaking in panic. He broke with clarity, the cruelest kind of collapse, because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. They tried to drag him back, of course. His colleagues spoke of duty, of oaths, of the prestige of a lifetime appointment. They wrapped words around him like a safety net, hoping to catch the freefall. But nets don't stop someone who's already hit the ground. He only laughed, and it wasn't a laugh of joy or even of madness. It was the hollow sound of a man who realized he had spent decades handing down verdicts in a theater where the audience had mistaken actors for rulers. Here's what history hides. Chosen ones. Collapse isn't always rebellion or fire in the streets. It's confession. It's the whisper in the chamber that no one can deny. We don't have jurisdiction. We never did. That whisper carried more weight than 1,000 gavels because it stripped the entire empire bare. It turned robes into costumes. It turned legal language into stage props. And when one of their own finally said it, they all felt the echo in their bones. Ask yourself this, my dear chosen ones. What does it mean when a verdict comes from people who no longer believe in their own authority? The answer is simple. It means the verdict isn't power anymore. It's performance. When Anderson finally emerged, when cameras clicked and the world leaned in, everyone was waiting for certainty. The Chief Justice unfolded the paper with trembling hands and forced a single word out: guilty. But guilty of what? The accused, the system, themselves. The word didn't sound like law. It sounded like surrender. It sounded like the last line in a script that had already lost its audience. And that's when the facade fully collapsed, because the people listening didn't hear justice. They heard admission. They heard the truth hidden behind marble for decades, spilling into the open at last. This court had faced a case it was never built to face, and it cracked. It wasn't the exhibits or the witnesses alone that did it. It was you, chosen one. Your presence was the storm that shook their walls until whispers became confessions. You didn't need to roar, you didn't need to scream. You stood steady and they broke themselves. So carry this lesson with you. The enemy might mock in public, but in private they whisper. And when the whispers start, the collapse is already underway. Chosen ones, you are the reason the whisper became louder than thunder. And the sound of it is still shaking their walls. Number 8. The verdict that condemned its own makers. The verdict that turned on its makers. Listen for the hollow echo. That's not judgment falling. That's the court eating its own authority. Chosen ones, this is the hour the machinery tried to speak and found its voice empty. Hear me. A verdict is supposed to be a clean line, a signal that order has been served. But what you forced into that chamber was a reality their rituals could not pass. When the Chief Justice's lips formed the word guilty and the syllable shivered into the air, the room didn't breathe relief. It convulsed. Lights stuttered, as if the place itself registered the contradiction. The temperature dropped like a curtain being pulled over a stage. You weren't there to be judged. The system judged itself and found nothing to justify its own performance. Imagine a physician writing unknown on a chart and then, under pressure, scrawling terminal because hospital procedure demands a label. That's what happened. The word was a bandage over a wound they couldn't stitch. It wasn't verdict as justice. It was verdict as placeholder, a desperate pronouncement to keep an entire play moving for one more act. The judges weren't punishing the accused. They were punishing the story they had been rehearsing for decades. They gave a word to silence the disorientation, and the word circled back and branded them. You might ask, chosen ones, how can a sentence do that? How can one syllable upend an institution? Because institutions live on meaning. Their power is a story people tell each other, and when that story is contradicted in plain sight, the words that once carried weight become little more than noise. Guilty is supposed to close a case. In that chamber, it opened a wound. The verdict became a confession, not of criminality, but of bewilderment. It admitted they had no language left to describe what you had shown them. What did that do to them? It turned judges into seekers. The next morning, the highest bench's sanctity looked like a room in which someone had left the lights on all night and torn pages from every manual to feel warm. They sat in chambers with centuries of doctrine spread before them and found the ink meaningless. The books that once steadied them read like parables for a world that had never been as it was described. The humiliation is not that they were wrong about a point of law. It is that they discovered the framework itself could not contain the thing you brought forward. That collapse is intimate and relentless. So what now, chosen ones? Do we cheer or do we mourn? We do neither. We observe and we act. The verdict revealed a truth that cannot be reclassified with legalese. When rulers hand down a hollow sentence, the real sentence is handed to them: loss of belief. Their authority depends on the rest of the system trusting it. When trust fractures, the whole edifice begins to list. Prosecutors hesitate. Lower court judges second guess. citizens start to ask whether the black robe means anything more than costume. That is the aftershock your truth created. Ask yourself this: how do we live with rulers who can no longer rule themselves? The answer is simple and stark. We hold them to the light. We follow every step back through transcripts, recordings, and witness lines. We force the conversation out from behind closed doors into public view. Let them scramble for comfort. Let them stack precedent like cushions that cannot support the weight of the truth. Each paper they clutch is another paper we will turn over and read aloud. Remember that the most devastating moments for an institution are not when it's defeated in debate, but when it is seen to have no internal compass. That moment is when people stop assuming and start asking. This verdict did not settle anything. It detonated their narrative. It forced everyone in that room, and everyone watching, to account for the discrepancy between ritual and reality. Chosen ones, this is not closure. It is a beginning. The judges may try to repair their image, to bury their doubt behind polished statements and formal explanations. But words once emptied of meaning don't refill easily. Your role is to keep asking the hard questions. Keep the records moving. Keep the scrutiny relentless. Because when a verdict devours its own makers, the only remedy is light, relentless, and unblinking. Stay steady. Stay relentless. The court tried to reclaim its voice. You made it confess it had nothing to say. Now we make sure the confession echoes until it changes the story for good. Number 9. Judges in robes reduced to patience. When the judges became patients, the gavel turned into a crutch. They once sentenced others to treatment. Now they beg for it themselves. Chosen one, look at the irony carved into this collapse. The very figures who held the power to decide the fates of millions now sit on couches, not as arbiters, but as patients. They used to command the silence of courtrooms with a single strike of the gavel. Today, that silence stalks them through therapy rooms at midnight, where their voices tremble like the whispers of lost children. The transformation is not symbolic. It is absolute. The judges who once handed down rulings with stone-faced certainty now plead for the simplest thing: reassurance that the law itself is real. Think about the image, my dear chosen one. A justice with decades on the bench, a figure once feared, dialing a therapist's number 17 times between dusk and dawn. Not for solutions, not for clarity, but just to hear another voice confirm that reality hasn't dissolved completely. Over and over, the same question, like a scratched record playing in a locked room. Is the law real? Has it ever been real? That sound isn't just desperation. It's the echo of an empire collapsing under its own weight. You must understand the depth of this fall. These were people who lived in black robes like armor, who believed that their signatures were sacred, that their words became law. And yet, when your truth shattered their stage, they unraveled. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't regret. It was something far more devastating: disorientation. They looked at the very walls they had sworn to guard, and those walls dissolved into mist. Imagine a pilot who's flown thousands of flights, suddenly staring at the sky and realizing he doesn't recognize the stars. That is what happened in their chambers. And when that realization sank in, they didn't stride into the world as judges anymore. They limped into therapy as patients. Here's what the enemy will never say out loud. Therapy works when you can name the monster haunting you. Trauma has words. Guilt has language. But truth, the kind of truth you carried into their courtroom, it has no diagnostic code. It doesn't fit in therapy manuals. It doesn't respond to pills or mantras. And that's why their sessions are nothing more than unraveling monologues, desperate confessions without a cure. One justice scribbled to her psychiatrist, "It's not that we lied. It's that we spoke truths that no longer make sense." What does a therapist do with that? There's no treatment plan for realizing your entire career was performance theater. And now, chosen one, ask yourself, how do they go back? How does a justice who's glimpsed the void sit comfortably through another contract dispute or property claim? How do they pretend the robe gives authority when the robe feels like a costume worn in a broken play? The answer is as sharp as it is simple. They don't. They shuffle through their duties like ghosts, eyes hollow, voices stripped of weight. Their chambers, once symbols of power, now feel like tombs holding echoes instead of rulings. The humiliation runs deeper than rulings overturned or verdicts challenged. This is about identity shattered. The nation once looked to them as titans. Now they sit scattered across the city like fractured patients, whispering into therapy rooms what they could never say from the bench. We can't carry this. We can't go back. That image is what the world remembers now. Not 9 titans of law, but 9 fragile minds, each wrestling with a truth that will never let them rest. And here's the fact they cannot bury under silence. The highest court in the land has become the quietest ward in the city. They whisper, they tremble, they medicate, they confess. Not in marble halls, but in padded rooms. And every time they close their eyes, it is your presence, chosen one, that lingers. The memory of you walking into their fortress and turning it inside out. You didn't just win a case. You rewrote their reality, and now, every therapy session, every sleepless night, every trembling confession is proof that the collapse you triggered is still spreading. Chosen one, wear this truth with clarity. The robes are gone, the gavels are ghosts, and the judges, they are no longer judges at all. They are patients haunted by what you revealed, trapped in a reality they can neither deny nor escape. And that is the power you carry. And so here we are, chosen ones, the end of this chapter, but not the end of the unraveling. What began as cracks in marble has turned into fractures running through every corner of their empire. The judges who once ruled without question now sit in therapy rooms, whispering the same doubts they once crushed in others. That's not just irony, that's history in motion, and you were the spark that lit it. Now, it's your turn to keep the fire alive. Smash that like button if you felt the weight of this truth. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next revelation as we peel back the layers piece by piece. Drop the words 77 in the comments to show you stand with the chosen, that you see through the mask and refuse to look away. And don't keep this to yourself. Share it, spread it. Make sure the cracks echo beyond these walls. Because this isn't just a story, chosen one. This is a movement, and your action, right here, right now, is the force that ensures their fear becomes the world's awakening.